Picture this. It's the 1890s. You're a devout Victorian archaeologist, a true gentleman scholar, standing in a dimly lit chamber deep inside an ancient Egyptian tomb. For decades, you've dedicated your life to the glory of the pharaohs. You've unearthed beautiful treasures, magnificent artifacts, and the serene, sanitized version of ancient Egypt that history books love to celebrate. But today, you've stumbled upon something else entirely, something so vile, so explicit, so contrary to everything you've ever believed about this civilized society, that it makes your blood run cold. It's a papyrus scroll, an ancient text, not filled with prayers to the gods or tales of military victory, but with descriptions of sexual acts so extreme they would traumatize a modern mind. You can't just ignore it. You can't show it to the world, so you make a decision that would create the biggest cover-up in archaeological history. You hide the evidence. This wasn't fiction. This was the reality of a secret that has been systematically concealed for over a century. You think you know about Egyptian civilization, the golden treasures, the mysterious pyramids. Here's what they don't teach you in school. Ancient Egypt was a civilization where intimate practices were so extreme they would shock the most liberal modern minds, where royal children were subjected to horrific abuse by their own families, and where religious festivals turned into week-long orgies of sexual chaos. What I'm about to show you will make you question everything you thought you knew about one of history's greatest civilizations. Because the truth about Egyptian sexual practices is so disturbing that museums and scholars around the world tried to hide the evidence for over a century. The unspoken religion. Along the fertile banks of the Nile between 3100 BCE and 30 BCE, the Egyptians developed a belief system that transformed every act of intimacy into a conversation with the gods. Every orgasm was a prayer. Every sexual act was a vital ritual. They believed that sexual energy was cosmic energy, and that the pharaoh, as a living god, had to prove his divine potency to ensure the fertility of the Nile and the survival of their civilization. This created enormous pressure to prove divine power through increasingly extreme displays. The evidence for this comes from places tourists never see: temple inscriptions that were plastered over, papyrus documents so explicit they were hidden in museum basements, and archaeological discoveries that Victorian scholars deliberately concealed from public view. When 19th-century archaeologists first encountered this evidence, they were so scandalized that they didn't just ignore it. They actively destroyed it or locked it away, unable to reconcile their sanitized view of Egypt with the horrifying reality before them. But the hidden evidence of this cosmic sexuality came with a dark side. Children born into elite families found themselves trapped in a system that treated their bodies as religious property. Domestic slaves faced systematic sexual abuse that was considered not just legal, but religiously necessary. And when things went wrong, when the Nile didn't flood or crops failed, the sexual practices became increasingly desperate and violent. The first hint of this vast cover-up wasn't a hidden papyrus. It was a seemingly innocuous medical detail found on the most famous mummy of them all. Section 2. The Missing Organs, Tutankhamun's Secret. The discovery that first opened this horrifying chapter of history wasn't made in some dramatic tomb excavation, but in a quiet laboratory in 1925. Howard Carter's team was conducting the first detailed examination of Tutankhamun's mummy when they noticed something that would haunt Egyptology for the next century. The boy king's genitals were missing. They weren't damaged or decayed. They had been surgically removed with the precision of a skilled physician. The cut marks were clean, deliberate, and showed signs of having been made shortly after death, as part of the mummification process. But Tutankhamun wasn't alone. As more royal mummies were examined with increasingly sophisticated techniques, a disturbing pattern emerged. Multiple pharaohs and nobles showed evidence of genital removal or modification. Some had been completely castrated. Others showed signs of enhancement procedures involving the insertion of foreign materials. The most shocking discovery came from the tomb of an unnamed prince from the 18th dynasty. whose mummy revealed evidence that the removal had been performed while he was still alive. Medical analysis of the bone structure and tissue remains suggested this wasn't a punishment or an accident, but a deliberate religious procedure. Ancient Egyptian texts began to make disturbing sense. References to making the dead more perfect for the afterlife and preparing the body for eternal service to the gods took on a sinister new meaning. The implications were staggering. If the Egyptians were routinely modifying the genitals of their dead, what did this say about their attitudes towards sexuality and the human body? Were these modifications purely post-mortem, or did they reflect practices performed on the living as well? This physical evidence provided a chilling confirmation of the stories locked away in forgotten texts. It explained why early Egyptologists, when they encountered these explicit images and mummified remains, didn't just ignore them. They actively suppressed the evidence, removing artifacts from public view and editing descriptions out of official reports. For over a century, the true extent of these Egyptian sexual practices was concealed not by ancient secrecy, but by modern shame. Section 3. The hidden economy of exploitation. But the missing genitals were just the beginning. The Egyptian power structure operated through a rigid hierarchy that dictated every part of life. At the top were the pharaohs, whose symbolic vitality was believed to ensure the prosperity of the land. Below them, nobles and priests carried the burden of proving their devotion through elaborate rituals. At the lowest tier were household servants, some taken into service at a very early stage in life, who endured demanding roles under a system that often claimed divine authority. Those brought into the temples at a young age faced a path that was both prestigious and punishing. Ancient records suggest that families offered their youngest members for ceremonial duties, where they were trained for long hours to master complex forms of service. They were taught absolute obedience and conditioned to see themselves as vessels of divine will. Ancient papyri describe the toll of this life. Continuous physical drills led to chronic injuries. Restricted diets designed to maintain a certain ceremonial appearance often hindered healthy development. The relentless pace of rituals and the absence of personal freedom left many in fragile health, with some not surviving beyond their youth. The hardships did not end at the temple gates. Historical accounts reveal that prestigious households sometimes selected attendants for highly personal roles, chosen for their adaptability and refinement. These individuals could be traded or reassigned, with their value based on skill, appearance, and training. Many who grew up in such conditions carried deep emotional scars, often withdrawing from society or struggling to build trusting relationships later in life. Perhaps most unsettling was the way these practices were framed as acts of honor. Priests preached that any service to the gods was the highest calling, and families were encouraged to celebrate the selection of their kin for such duties. Yet beneath the grand titles and ceremonial robes lay a system that commodified human lives. Archaeological studies reveal alarmingly high mortality rates among temple recruits, while the patronage of the elite kept this network of exploitation thriving for centuries. Section 4. The Feast of Drunkenness. When chaos was holy. But if you think that's the worst thing Egyptian children faced, you're not ready for what's coming next. This systematic abuse was nothing compared to what happened during the Feast of Drunkenness, Egypt's most notorious religious festival. What I'm about to reveal involves practices so extreme that when early archaeologists discovered evidence, they literally burned the documents rather than translate them for public consumption. What I'm about to describe will make everything you just heard seem like a children's story. The Feast of Drunkenness represented the absolute pinnacle of Egyptian sexual extremism, an annual festival dedicated to the goddess Hathor that transformed the entire civilization into a week-long orgy of violence, sex, and religious chaos. The festival's origins lay in Egyptian mythology, specifically the story of Sekhmet, the lioness goddess who nearly destroyed humanity in a drunken rage. According to the legend, the gods had to flood Egypt with beer mixed with red ochre to make Sekhmet think she was drinking blood, causing her to become so intoxicated that she forgot her murderous mission and transformed into the gentler Hathor. This myth became the template for an annual celebration that encouraged every Egyptian to drink themselves into a state of divine possession. But the festival went far beyond simple intoxication. Participants believed that in their drunken state, they became vessels for the gods themselves, free to act on any impulse without moral or legal consequence. The preparation began months in advance. Temple authorities would brew massive quantities of beer, often adding psychoactive substances derived from lotus flowers and other plants. The resulting mixture didn't just intoxicate, it created vivid hallucinations and dramatically lowered inhibitions. Participants reported experiencing visions, hearing divine voices, and feeling possessed by supernatural forces. When the festival began, normal social rules completely disappeared. Masters had sex with slaves in public squares. Married women abandoned their families to join roving revelers. Children were exposed to explicit, intimate acts and often became participants themselves. The entire civilization descended into chaos that lasted for 7 days and nights. Ancient texts describe scenes that shock even modern readers. Of intoxicated Egyptians would storm through cities, breaking into homes and forcing inhabitants to join their celebrations. Women were subjected to group abuse that was considered religious communion. Men competed to see who could maintain sexual arousal for the longest periods while completely intoxicated. The violence was as extreme as the sexuality. Participants would attack each other with sexual frenzy, biting, scratching, and inflicting wounds that were considered marks of divine favor. Some revelers died from internal injuries caused by violent sexual acts. Others were trampled by crowds of intoxicated celebrants moving through narrow streets. The religious justification made everything even more disturbing. Priests taught that any act performed during the festival was by definition holy, since participants were possessed by divine spirits. Abuse became religious communion. Violence became a sacred offering. Child abuse became a divine blessing. Foreign visitors left accounts that reveal international horror at these celebrations. Mesopotamian diplomats described the festival as proof that Egyptians were barbarians, disguised as a sophisticated civilization. Some kingdoms refused to even send ambassadors to Egypt during festival periods, fearing for their safety and moral contamination. Section 5. The fall of a sexual empire. The festival's aftermath was as traumatic as the event itself. Participants often had no memory of what they had done while intoxicated, leading to psychological trauma when they discovered evidence of their actions. Families were destroyed when members learned what their relatives had done during the celebration. Children born 9 months after the festival faced stigma as offspring of divine possession rather than normal conception. But the collapse of Egyptian sexual culture began during the Ptolemaic period, when Greek rulers attempted to impose Mediterranean values on Egyptian religious practices. The clash between Greek rationalism and Egyptian sexual mysticism created a crisis that ultimately destroyed both systems. The Ptolemies, despite being foreign rulers, felt compelled to participate in Egyptian religious festivals to maintain legitimacy with their subjects. But their Greek sensibilities were horrified by the extreme sexual practices they encountered. Cleopatra I attempted to modify the Feast of Drunkenness, reducing its duration and imposing limits on the violence and public sexuality. These reforms triggered a religious crisis. Egyptian priests argued that modifying the festival would anger the gods and bring cosmic disaster. They pointed to natural disasters, military defeats, and economic problems as evidence that the gods were already displeased with foreign interference in sacred traditions. The crisis reached its peak during the reign of Cleopatra VII, who faced the impossible task of satisfying both Egyptian religious expectations and Roman political demands. Roman observers were scandalized by Egyptian sexual practices, viewing them as evidence of barbarism and moral decay. But Egyptian priests threatened rebellion if traditional festivals were abandoned entirely. Cleopatra's solution was to create private versions of the festivals for Egyptian religious leaders, while presenting a more modest public face to Roman audiences. This compromise satisfied no one and created a culture of hypocrisy that undermined both Egyptian religious authority and Roman political control. The abuse of children became even more systematic during this period, as desperate rulers tried to prove their devotion to Egyptian traditions while hiding the evidence from Roman oversight. Child slaves were trafficked in larger numbers, their abuse conducted in secret chambers that Roman officials were not allowed to enter. The psychological toll on Egyptian society was enormous. When external pressure forced changes to these practices, many Egyptians experienced a form of cultural trauma. They had lost not just religious traditions, but their entire framework for understanding sexuality and divine relationship. The final collapse came with the Roman conquest in 30 BCE. Augustus Caesar was horrified by what his forces discovered in Egyptian temples and immediately ordered the suppression of sexual religious practices. Roman soldiers destroyed explicit artwork, burned religious texts, and executed priests who refused to abandon traditional ceremonies. But the Romans didn't just suppress Egyptian sexual practices, they systematically erased evidence of their existence. Temples were stripped of explicit decorations, papyri describing sexual rituals were burned, and even architectural features designed for religious sexuality were destroyed or hidden. Section 6. The Great Concealment and the Enduring Legacy. The Romans, in their pragmatic way, couldn't completely destroy all the evidence. What they left behind would, centuries later, shock Victorian archaeologists into creating the greatest cover-up in archaeological history. The systematic concealment of Egyptian sexual practices began not with some ancient conspiracy, but with Victorian moral sensibilities that simply couldn't handle the archaeological truth. The pattern was established early. When Giovanni Belzoni discovered explicitly sexual wall paintings in the tomb of Seti I in 1817, he immediately ordered them covered with plaster rather than documented. His published account described the tomb as containing beautiful religious scenes, while completely omitting the graphic content that filled several chambers. This became standard practice. Auguste Mariette, the founder of the Egyptian Antiquity Service, maintained private collections of explicit artifacts that were never displayed publicly. When the Egyptian Museum in Cairo was established, entire categories of artifacts were relegated to restricted storage areas that only male scholars could access. The suppression wasn't limited to imagery. Victorian translators routinely edited sexual content out of ancient texts, replacing explicit descriptions with euphemistic phrases or simply omitting entire passages. The famous Ebers Papyrus, one of the most important medical texts from ancient Egypt, had over 40 sections dealing with sexual practices that weren't translated until the 1970s. Perhaps most shocking was the outright destruction of evidence. The British archaeologist Flinders Petrie openly admitted to destroying artifacts he considered too obscene for public consumption, describing in his journals how he burned papyri, smashed statues, and tore up artifacts that depicted sexual acts he couldn't bring himself to document. The cover-up extended to academic institutions and museums. Universities refused to fund research into Egyptian sexuality, considering it inappropriate for scholarly study. Museums developed elaborate systems for hiding sexual artifacts, relegating thousands of items to restricted access areas with vague labels like miscellaneous pottery or decorative objects. Even today, this Victorian legacy continues to shape public understanding of ancient Egypt. Popular documentaries and museum exhibitions focus on political history and artistic achievements, while completely ignoring the sexual practices that were central to Egyptian culture. The result is a sanitized version of history that bears little resemblance to the complex and often disturbing reality of ancient Egyptian life. Conclusion: history's unspoken lessons. For over 3,000 years, Egyptian civilization created and maintained practices that treated children as sexual property, normalized violence as religious worship, and used intimacy as a weapon of cosmic control. The ongoing concealment of these truths has created massive gaps in public knowledge about human sexuality, religious practices, and social organization in one of history's most influential civilizations. The horrors hidden in Egyptian tombs and texts reveal a crucial lesson: how easily religious devotion can transform into systematic abuse when human sexuality becomes a tool of cosmic control. If this glimpse into history's hidden darkness has left you wanting to uncover more buried truths, subscribe to Unexplained History so we can continue peeling back the layers of history together. These forgotten voices deserve to be heard, and there are so many more stories waiting to be told.